Hi! Balanced Druids. Perhaps the most unique spec in WoW. The so-called portrayals of the balance between the sun and the moon, and being a hybrid between a walrus and a chicken, and you want to top the DPS on it.
Bad news, everyone!
In this video I intend to prove why it will be extremely hard to actually get that 100, and also to provide some context behind some talent choices. This is because I see many people asking for what talent builds are the best for whatever situation or boss, but what about taking the time to actually understand that some of these suggestions may or may not even matter and you might just be hindering yourself or your guild for no reason? Obviously there's many reasons that may factor into why you might be doing everything as optimal as you can and you are still unable to get the best results. Every single spec in the game suffers from this to a certain degree, but as balance, there are two main factors that are completely out of your control. On one hand, you have an amazing system called Eclipse, which is indeed the bread and butter of our spec and what makes us unique in comparison with any other spec in the game, and for those who aren't aware. To keep it simple, the Balanced Druid rotation revolves around two core spells. These spells have a chance to proc a buff called Eclipse, which empowers your Wrath or Starfire depending on the Eclipse state. Now to proc Solar Eclipse, you have a 100% chance to do so when a Starfire hits the target and crits. For Lunar, it's slightly different, you need to land that Wrath, which if it crits, you have a 60% chance to proc Lunar Eclipse, meaning that, let's say that by having 30% crit on your gear, you actually have an 18% chance to proc it, which allows you for moments like a fluid, instant Lunar Eclipse, or, I don't know, maybe 30 Wraths later? And the other main factor that will affect our DPS is the Demonic Pact, which will fluctuate a lot in regards to the amount of spell power that it provides. To demonstrate this, I just cropped a couple of progress swipes in Thorum with my guild on the same day, and as you can see, this would be enough to impact our DPS in a noticeable way. And to expand on this, I just went back to phase 1 and selected the holy grail of all single target fights.
Patchwork want to play.
And then looked for two really similar attempts performed by the same person, with basically the same kill time, gear and raid composition. And if you take the time to actually analyze why you have a difference of 1000 DPS in between a span of a week, when technically nothing changed, you will see that the two main culprits will be Demonic Pact and Eclipse. Furthermore, I zoomed back a couple of weeks on the logs of this specific person, and although he had basically best in slot for a couple of months already, you can not only see an overall positive increase over the weeks, which kinda makes sense, but also how much the DPS noticeably swings from week to week. Regarding talent builds, I'm going to start by suggesting a one all-purpose build that will allow you to perform in raid and is especially good for progress. There's a 2 talent point missing and you have the option to spend it on mana regen or some extra DPS, which will depend on your current gear and progress, and you have access to your main cooldowns, utility, mana sustain and AoE. This build also allows you to give away your innervate to your healers, or heal if needed during progress, or use Rebirth without feeling like you lack the mana to resume the fight, or you have to randomly use a mana pot, and it allows you to use Hurricane without being dependent on Omen procs. Now, if you have the option of using a secondary spec, you can then devise a more single target oriented build, which by default those fights are less mana intensive and you literally don't need to do AoE, so there's no point in keeping certain talents. Now, having set two main builds, and to make it easier to explain the talents themselves, I'm going to start by identifying our main, or what I would call mandatory talents. These, for the most part, don't require a lot of explanation, being themselves kinda self-explanatory. We are talking about reducing the cast time of spells, DPS cooldowns, extending dots and other obvious things. And now knowing this, let's start by exploring the remaining ones. Starting on the Restoration tree. In order to advance to the third row, you will need to spend 7 points. You'll always spend 2 of them in Mark of the Wild, and for the most part, 5 points on Furor. But for fights like Thorum, Algalon and possibly Yogg, there's an argument to invest in maxing out Nature's Focus to avoid the pushback from unavoidable abilities. On the 3rd row, you have Omen of Clarity. For all intents and purposes, you kinda want to keep this one. It's basically our best mana talent, and there's too many situations where you have a real chance of running out of mana, even on shorter fights without it. Next, you have Intensity, which is in most situations our 2nd best mana sustain talent. It's obviously a good option for progression, whenever you can't guarantee your inner void for yourself, or when you have to do heavy AoE. Now sliding back to the balance tree, to be able to advance to the 3rd row of talents, you'll need to spend 10 points, so having set 7 of them, what do you do with the remaining 3? Are you having mana issues? Then go with Moonglow. Feeling like you have a full tank of mana because the fights don't last long enough, or you have a larger mana pool that allows you to no longer feel like you need the mana reduction from it, then go for Genesis or Improve Moonfire. For the next row we have the same issue, although I would appeal for the following. Fellow Moonkins, please use the 2 talent points on Nature's Reach. Every single tank in the world will appreciate it, and you'll probably avoid some awkward moments. And then you have Brambles, and oh well, you'll encounter situations where you can spend a couple of points either here or on Genesis or even on Improvement Fire, and when we compare this and seems, this talent is indeed a better DPS game. Now, the actual plot twist is these things are actually plagued with a crappy Wrath of the Lich King pet UI. And I swear to you, man, these things were made just to die, or you just have a random mechanic that will kill them, and you may postpone using them to avoid this situation, but sometimes you don't really have a choice. Or they just enjoy the fire, or something. Just move, mate. So overall, our trends tend to die way too quickly or way too randomly, or they just don't even get the DPS benefits on certain fight mechanics, like on Vezax, where you have the buff from the puddles, but the friends don't benefit from it, but your gods do. On Holy, you have the light beams, and guess what? And good luck trying to get those things to stand on the blue rune on Iron Council. Rant over. On the next row, you'll have Improved Insect Swarm, which will be your priority to maximize once you start freeing up some points somewhere. For Dream State, it's just worse than Intensity on most situations, and assuming that if you aren't casting, you can drink, which kinda makes this talent worse just by default. Balance of Power is pretty much straightforward, but sometimes you can't control what gear you have available to you, so this is something that you can play around if you have too much hit rating. The next row is pretty simple. Do you actually need to AoE? Then go for Gale-Winds and Typhoon. Do you just need the utility? Maybe for Algalon if you are asked? Then just keep Typhoon. Oh, and I almost forgot. So Alkane Frenzy. I can hear you already.
But it's a PvP talent.
People. I left this talent for last because I'm indeed annoyed when I see people saying this, and here's a reality check. This talent seems way less reliable in comparison to when we were doing Nax, where you had a little bit more certainty that it would proc on a couple of fights. So for all intents and purposes, I would put this talent or slot it in as a only use once you have a way higher gear score, and you are obviously outside of progress. There's no valid argument in the world that will convince me that this talent is not worth under those conditions, because in alternative you would spend 2 or 3 points in Genesis, which is at best a 15 DPS increase. And overall, man, you are already playing the luck game with many other factors. Why not just double down on it and get a better result if all the freaking stars align? Now, this can proc on any fight, but the only ones that I can actually see this talent proccing in any kind of reliable way would be Thorum, Algalon, and maybe Yogg, which kinda means that it will take a while until I would recommend this on any 25-man setting. For a quick note on glyphs, believe it or not, we actually have those available too. you'll run around most of the time with these four, so Insect Swarm, Focus, Starfall and Starfire. For Insect Swarm is really simple, it increases the damage of, and you will never guess it, Insect Swarm, and you want to have it on 100% of the time. Glyph of Focus reduces the range of your Starfall in exchange for a little bit more damage. You'll use this most of the time, and as long as you can actually hit the target, which in some circumstances it's not even about player skill. There is multiple examples where fight mechanics will make you not be in range. For example, you'll have Hodir, where you have random spawns on the location of the light memes. Vezax is basically out of range all the time, and for Memeron and Freya, you may or may not be in range at all. On the other hand, do not try to do Algalon without this glyph. So what do I use then, I hear you ask? Glyph of Starfire is your solution to when Glyph of Focus seems like a bad idea, and it's totally worth for fights where you can extend a highly buff Moonfire, like on Iron Council or on Vezax, because there's no way your Starfall is going to hit the boss with a reduced range, and even if you were able to, you are literally spamming Starfire for the entire fight. Glyph of Starfall just reduces the cooldown, and normally you just want to keep it all the time. Exceptions are, or will be, fights under 2 minutes, where you won't be able to use the extra Starfall provided by having this glyph, which makes it totally useless. And on a relevant note, the DPS difference between Glyph of Focus and Starfire is a little bit irrelevant, meaning that you are better off just choosing what feels better or what makes sense for a specific fight. And for miners, just make sure you have some glyphs of Typhon laying around to make the DPS ability worth to cast when you need to move. Going back to talents, specifically where you are spending your points, here is the DPS gain per point spent on Genesis. And when you really think about it, you don't really benefit that much from having them, so there's no need to gimp yourself for 6 or even 30 DPS in a world where RNG is actually a big factor and it can completely mess up your best efforts. Obviously, you can run around without Omen to be able to spend those extra points in Genesis, and I've been testing around with running this build on a couple of fights and it's indeed doable, even though those kill times are kinda high. But if I had to give away my Innervate on XT, for example, I would have been out of mana mid-fight, and this is the kind of thing or situations that I want you to think about whenever you see a build like this. You are basically completely sacrificing your mana regen so you can technically do a really small amount of increased damage that will not make a difference at all. So by running around on 2 builds, you can optimize your own DPS on one and attend to the needs of your guild on the other, which kinda addresses the previous situation, and obviously with gear upgrades and after progression is done, you can be way more crazy with your own builds, which mostly revolves around sacrificing mana for more damage. And in conclusion, I wanted to provide an explanation and the logic behind why you would run with specific talents or glyphs so you can ascertain and apply it correctly to your own builds without being misled or compromising your own ability to actually continue DPSing throughout the fight and use your own utility to the benefit of others, because you are indeed trying to progress a boss and not just there to parse. And with this, I hope you have enjoyed the video, and I'll see you around. Or not. Bye.